Hi, everyone. This is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology, and today we're going to take a look at this weekend's solar eclipse in the sign of Cancer. Now, there's a number of different ways in which we're going to cover this. I'm going to try to go quickly through everything so that it's kind of packed in tightly for you. But the general thing we're going to do is first look at the timing, and then we're going to look at this within the context of the larger eclipse cycles that have been happening in Cancer and Capricorn, as these are the last. And we're going to have another one on July 4th in Capricorn. And then today we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the alchemy of a solar eclipse in Cancer, and of the moon, and of silver versus lead, sort of moon versus Saturn stuff, which this eclipse cycle on the whole is generating. And I'll be doing a separate video down the line on the lunar eclipse in Capricorn on July 4th, but more on that later. I'll also be doing a quick tour through the 12 whole sign houses based on your rising sign. Where is this eclipse falling? What area of life might it affect? And where might you see it sort of showing up? So that's the outline for where we're going. Now, let's begin by just giving you a sense of when this eclipse is happening and what it looks like. You can see it right here. I've got it set to Baltimore, near where I reside. And the eclipse is happening on Sunday morning, June 21st, right at that amazing synchronicity, really, that it's coming in at the same time as the summer solstice. At the peak of the sun is being eclipsed. It's an interesting thing to think about. Mercury is also retrograde in Cancer, and they're coming together early Sunday morning here in East Coast time, which is going to be really early morning if you're on the West Coast in the United States, but you might be some other place in the world. So you think of this coming in, depending on your time zone, you can check exactly, but it's going to be taking place. Let's just make it super exact here. Get it? Yeah, so probably between 3:45 and 4:45 a.m. Eastern time on Sunday, June 21st. Now, the lunar eclipse in Capricorn will happen on July 4th. And that brings to a close our cycles of eclipses in Cancer and Capricorn. Now, if you want to look and see how far back those cycles go, let me just show you when the nodes of the moon ingressed into Cancer. So the nodes of the moon ingressed into Cancer, you can see here. Depending on if you use the mean or true node, of course, but this is right November of 2018, right around there. And the nodes would then spend all the way up until now, basically in Cancer and Capricorn, and those are where the eclipses have been formed. So now it's always interesting to track out eclipses, in my opinion, according to well, not just my opinion, this is something that mundane astrologers do, and it's to track out where the eclipses, where you can actually see the eclipses. This is from space.com. The first place that we will see the eclipse will be near the town of Imfondo in the northeastern Republic of the Congo. So it's going across Africa. Republic of the Congo, South Sudan, Ethiopia, etc. Before crossing the Red Sea into the Arabian Peninsula, it will then travel through Pakistan, northern India, and southern China before reaching Taiwan. The last place where people can see it, unless there are some lucky seamen located along its path out in the Pacific Ocean. So the eclipse especially is, you could say, across that swath of Africa, through Pakistan and northern India, and through China. Now, typically, mundane astrologers have a very elaborate and systematic way of examining the charts of eclipses and where they're falling, say, at the midheaven of a certain country or nation somewhere on the earth. I'm not going to get that detailed, but I will say that this being a very close, tight eclipse, because it's just barely off from the North Node at 29 Gemini, this eclipse has some real potency behind it. Typically, the closer it is to the node, the more potent it is. And we could see some real changes. I mean, I'm thinking, for example, of the relationship between Pakistan and India being perhaps pronounced in the year ahead or even the next 6 months. as well as southern China, Taiwan, those areas potentially being the center of, some form of upheaval or transformation that would be more acute. Now, that's just one way of doing eclipses, and I'll try to do that when eclipses are typically real close to the nodes like that. Just pay a little bit extra attention. Anyway, so that is some thoughts on where you might see the eclipse in the collective. Now, what I want to do is I want to just spin through the position of the eclipses according to your rising sign, and then I want to talk about the alchemy of a solar eclipse in the sign of the moon and the difference between, say, silver and lead, and some of those things that the moon and Saturn relate to across the Cancer-Capricorn axis, almost as a kind of cumulative reflection on where we've been, over the past year and a half with these eclipses and what might be wrapping up right now. Okay, so put the chart back on the screen, and we're going to start with Aries on the ascendant and just do just kind of a quick take on where you might see these energies expressing themselves. So if you are an Aries rising, we're looking at your whole sign houses, then you're thinking of the eclipse energy falling into the fourth house. Now remember that eclipses are, they come in two different kinds: the new moon solar eclipse and the full moon lunar eclipse. And those two different kinds of eclipses generally bring two different kinds of archetypal experiences. The new moon solar eclipse is always going to be about new beginnings. But this is like a mega new moon, right? It's like a supercharged new moon. So the new beginnings are more consequential. The chapter changes are more consequential. And because there's eclipsing involved, it can be unfortunate on some level, or challenging or difficult, as the new thing that is coming in is often happening because of unforeseen or difficult circumstances. So there's reason for hope in all solar eclipses and new beginnings and new moons, but we also have to recognize that eclipsing events often bring more acute cathartic transformations, very dynamic and not always entirely easy. The full moon lunar eclipse, on the other hand, which we'll study later when we get closer to the 4th of July, would bring a culminating or cumulative kind of effect, as in, the flowering stage of a plant as compared to the seeding stage. So when things are really manifesting and you're sort of harvesting the accumulated karma of a cycle, that's more of a full moon moment. And we're going to see that around the 4th of July. So at any rate, now, if you're an Aries rising, sorry for the interlude, if you're an Aries rising, this means that the new moon solar eclipse is going to fall in your 4th house of home and family. There's a lot of eclipses that have been happening in that area of life for you. And so the change continues here, with the emphasis being on things like home, family, parents, sometimes father in particular. With Cancer in your 4th, maybe more like mom, but definitely the emphasis on home, family, property, the roots or base or foundation of your life as a major concern. If we go to Taurus rising, we're going to be focusing on this eclipse in your 3rd house. And that new energy of the eclipse in the 3rd house will place an emphasis on topics like siblings, or, it was called the house of brethren and kin, communication, media, writing, learning, and sometimes also something happening in the more immediate sphere or environment, and also sometimes involving travel or transit. Even like cars can take place or can be related to the 3rd house. All right, let's go forward from there. So then we put Gemini on the ascendant, and this new moon energy, as well as Mercury retrograde, focused on the house of money, finances, business. So some changes happening there, and they've been happening there for a while. If we put Cancer on the ascendant, it's very personal. It might have to do with health, identity, style, psychology, self-examination, and health especially, as well as the inception, birth, or beginning of new things, because the 1st house is the rising place where planets appear for the first time. So really the quintessential house of newness and birth, but also it's a very, very personal house that often has to do with health and just personal psychology, sense of self, and direction in life. A lot of questions about that right now. Now, if we go forward from there, we're also going to have, then you got Leo on the ascendant, and we're putting the Cancer planets in the 12th house, where you might be dealing with themes of loss or ways in which you are being undermined or self-destructive or self-undermining. Sometimes it's by others, sometimes it's by yourself, probably with some pretty deep emotional, maybe even family ties, ancestral karma, the shadows of karma related to family, women, mothers, mothering, children. Some of the shadow material that's being worked on there can be more intense with this particular eclipse. But remember, you are just about to move out of this phase. So there's a kind of, an accumulation of stuff you've been working on for a while already. Now, if we go forward and put Virgo on the ascendant, we're going to move this eclipse into your 11th house. It's the place of groups, allies, and friends. Typically, this was a place that had to do with the people that you shared association with that had the same ambitions or goals, whether it was political or professional or religious. So, and it's a place of allies where we receive help from people or we contribute to some larger cause or we participate in a larger, say, association or organization of some kind. There's changes happening there, and there's been changes happening in that area of your life for a while. The social dimension of your life is changing, and it's going to continue to change in relation, perhaps even to family changes as well. Now, if we go forward from there and put Libra on the ascendant, it's all about work. You've got the eclipse happening in your 10th house, the place of action in the world. So your career, your vocation, or the things that you're involved with on the everyday, the work and practice of your everyday life. There's some big changes happening there. And again, it could have something to do with matters of home or family. The emotional nucleus of your life is always indicated by the the moon and Cancer and things like that. So interesting changes there for Libras. Now, we go forward and you're putting Scorpio on the ascendant next. If you're Scorpio rising, then this is happening in the 9th place, which is the place of religion, higher education, the higher mind, learning, long journeys or travel. And so there's maybe a paradigm change happening for you, or there is some learning something new. Mentors, teachers, and teaching, those kinds of topics can become really important during this time. And watch for this, of course, in the months ahead. Go forward a little bit more, and you've got Sagittarius on the ascendant, and then we're going to put the solar eclipse in your 8th house. You've been working on and will continue to work on the topic of emotional contracts with other people. Family members, death, inheritance in the family, sometimes relationship dynamics and the topic of money or finances combined. The intersection between you and other people, what you share, and the way in which you are obligated to others or they're obligated to you. And this is deeper emotional territory that may also have its roots in your family. And so those are some of the things to watch for if you're a Sag rising. Now, if you are in Capricorn rising territory, if that's you, then you have this eclipse as well as the Mercury retrograde happening in your 7th house of relationships. So you can watch for deeper, more intense transformations around your relationship, meeting someone, getting out of a relationship, the health or general life direction of a partner can be in the spotlight somehow as well. So those are things to watch for. Now, the other thing that's, so there we go. So Aquarius rising next. And there we go. So the Aquarius rising is going to put, if you're Aquarius rising, it's going to put the Cancer new moon energy into your 6th house. And that solar eclipse, along with Mercury retrograde, does imply kind of a heavier load of work, sometimes suffering, illness, trudging through some things. It can be more emotionally laborsome. And you can see, you also have Saturn, your ruling planet, in your 1st house. So if health problems have been an issue for you, there might be a time to, turn the page and get a healthier diet or, any form of self-care that you can offer yourself right now. If the universe is sort of knocking on the door of your body being like, hey, wake up because things aren't going so well. On the other hand, some degree of selfless service or sacrifice on behalf of family members or loved ones, sometimes sickness and health within the family in general, and sometimes just conflicts or difficulties or emotional turbulence around home or family. It's more of a difficult place for sure. These eclipses have been particularly difficult for, Aquarians over the past couple of years, year and a half. Okay, so then we have the Pisces is on the ascendant, last but not least, and that puts our solar eclipse energy into the fifth house of children, pregnancy, creativity, joy, pleasure. Sometimes there's going to be a new pregnancy, or the topic of sexuality and romance is going to be pronounced, or creativity in the arts, children, women and mothering. These things can all be sort of, just more pronounced in general. You can also see that the fifth house has to do with fun and pleasure and joy and happiness, and this may have its roots somehow in your family or your parents or the kind of ancestral karma. And so just questions about how to raise kids or your relationship with your kids or things happening in your kids' life often come up with eclipses in the fifth. But so too do issues around, just generally, what do I need on an emotional level to feel happy? Not like not content, but more like, when you go to a movie and you really love it, or you go to, a park and you really have a fun time. The fifth house was called the house of good fortune and the joy of Venus, which means it's really a house that's asking you to look at this question about pleasure on a deeper level. So that's a brief walkthrough of all 12 signs. Hopefully that is serviceable and gives you some good things to think about. Now, what I want to do last in this talk today is spend a little bit of time talking about the moon and the opportunity that we have before us, let's say alchemically, with these last eclipses in Cancer and Capricorn. And it makes sense to talk about this because, we've got Jupiter, Pluto, Saturn. There's so much energy in Capricorn, so much Saturn. It's nice so much of that Saturn energy that it's nice to reflect a little bit on the moon, which is the natural planetary contrary of Saturn, as well as the sun. That's because the signs that Saturn rules, Capricorn and Aquarius, are opposite to the signs that the lights rule, Cancer and Leo, which are the signs of the moon and the sun. So I want to talk about something called silvering. And this is a concept that I picked up from a great essay written by James Hillman. If you guys know my work, you know that I'm just absolutely obsessed with Hillman. He wrote a book called Alchemical Psychology. Well, it's a collection of essays, actually, of his on alchemy and psychology. And I'm going to read you something from a few little excerpts from his essay, which is called Silver and the White Earth. It's got to be one of my favorite essays of all time. And in fact, there's a really good audio series that you can find online if you search for James Hillman and alchemical psychology. And he actually has a talk on silver and the white earth that is just mind-blowing. Anyway, so let's talk for a minute about Saturn, because it's fun to get into the moon through Saturn sometimes as a way of understanding. You can't understand a planet unless you understand all the other planets. They don't exist in a vacuum, none of them. So Saturn is the dimmest, most distant planet, associated with lead, melancholy, winter, depression, death, old age, but also, gravitas and seriousness and a weighty, trustworthy, disciplined, mature, almost like grandmotherly energy. So Saturn is, Saturn is that planet that grants kind of staying power. It's the austerity of sitting, in meditation under the tree, as the earth grows right around you, So Saturn has that feeling of, endurance and persistence over long periods of time. There's a lot to love about Saturn, in fact. But let's talk about Saturn now. And one of the ways that ancient astrologers talked about Saturn was in terms of the phrase feigned appearances. And you've probably heard me say this before. As a planet related to feigned appearances, Saturn represents, for example, the status quo. Everything in the world that everyone tells us we should like or value in order to be normal and to fit in, that ends up feeling like dead weight, that ends up feeling like dead matter, that ends up feeling false or inauthentic. There's a great movie that came out when I think I was in like high school or college, and it was called American Beauty. Maybe you've seen it. It had Kevin Spacey in it. I think Annette Bening was in it. There was some other, I can't remember the name. There was a couple of younger actors too that ended up having careers that were, I think that it kind of took off from that point. Anyway, in the movie, it's that cookie cutter sort of suburbia, just like, you know, sort of white suburban America. And I won't give it away in case you haven't seen it. See it if you want to see a study in, if you want to see a study in silvering, and if you want to see a study in Saturn versus the moon. And they're neighbors. They're like next door neighbors. In fact, they are next door neighbors within our own houses. You have a photographer boy who's like living next door, and he's got a really militant, angry, abusive father. And then you have Kevin Spacey, who's living kind of like this bored existence. He's just like bored with the status quo. And as his realization occurs that he is living completely out of touch with what is real and true, kind of a midlife crisis. His wife's trying to be like, yeah, you're just having a midlife crisis. And he's getting kind of totally, he's like, this is all fake. It's all totally, so he's realizing this is all lead. This is all heavy, dense, fake, dead matter. Just blah. So that's a Saturnine realization. Meanwhile, next door, his daughter, Kevin Spacey's daughter, is sort of being he's kind of being photographed by the next door neighbor who has this eye for beauty. He sees the world as shimmering with beauty, and all of the mundane things that look dead or dull, he's somehow able to capture their essence and their beauty. Of course, his father is closet homosexual and very much in denial about it, and ashamed of it and not at all owning it, right? So that becomes really critical to the plot line, because there's this next door neighbor who has this very rigid, intense Saturnine disposition. And it turns out that he also is living with a feigned appearance of being tough and very, very masculine and all of this. And so the movie is a study between Saturn and the moon, and the way that Saturn and the moon live in our neighborhood. You know what I mean? And it's in every neighborhood. It could be any neighborhood whatsoever in the world. There is the keeping up with the Joneses. There's the cutting the yard. There is the way in which domestic life takes on the appearance that we think represents happiness. And this could be in an apartment, not necessarily in a domestic family setting either. It could just be solo existence. But there's a way in which we try to make our life look the part. And then if it's not authentic, there is a way in which eventually the weight and the burden and the feigned appearance of our life will start to weigh us down. We'll feel depressed, we'll feel melancholic. And it is specifically at that moment where the depression, we either sink and get crushed beneath it, or there's this breakthrough that happens. And usually the breakthrough happens where the cracks in the foundation, start appearing, and then light starts pouring through. And this is actually the dim, distant Saturn as the lead and the feigned appearance and the heavy, dark thing. And then the moon, which is a rock, basically, but it gathers this reflective light, and then the lead, the rock that does not have any light of its own accord, starts to shimmer and shine with this kind of translucent beauty. So the Moon Saturn dynamic is really present in that movie. If you haven't seen it, go see it. And this is a really beautiful part of the sort of deeper alchemy of a long series of eclipses and Saturn sign and the moon sign and Saturn sign, back and forth, back and forth. We can start to see the feigned appearance of our lives. We can start to see the heavy, dull brick of our lives. And if it doesn't weigh us down and crush us, and it can do that a little bit, maybe it does that in part, but if it doesn't do that, then it creates this need for the silver light to start pouring through the cracks so that we can remember or see again that thing shimmering in the dead world that is alive. Usually when we feel pent up for a long time, and this was something that Ficino, the Renaissance astrologer, talked about. He was a great translator of Platonic tradition and translated those texts again back into Europe, and kind of bringing them, revitalizing them, and was also a great astrologer. And he talked a lot about melancholy and Saturn. And the way in which you need melancholy, you need this kind of depressive state sometimes to, that its function is that the more you're weighed down, the more that this kind of pneuma, this pent up imaginative spiritual breath of life starts to become more intense. And a person's fantasy life becomes richer and richer. And this is exactly what happens to Kevin Spacey, where the weight of the feigned appearance of Saturn and the lead in his life is so heavy that he starts entertaining all of these elaborate fantasies. And that's a part of how the movie unfolds too. Until finally, if you're not sort of crushed beneath the weight of it, then the cracks start appearing and the silver light starts to pour through. So the silver and the lead, they go together. They're part of this deep alchemy. This is just kind of a basic experience, or a basic description, I mean. So when you have the silver starting to shine through, this pent-up pneuma, this pent-up imaginative energy in the soul starts finding its way out. And at first it can just be through fantasy, but then it comes in through things like memory. It comes in through nostalgia. It comes in through romantic longing. It comes in through artistic yearnings and expression. And it often will also come in through the need for contemplative practices, which is finally when you could say the spiritual alchemy occurs, when one realizes that one needs a way of taking this pent-up pneuma from out of the dead matter of the world and aiming it, back to the heavens. And so one might take up nature writing or photography or, journaling, or one may circumambulate, the shrine and chant the mala, which is 108 beads, which is a sacred number associated with the moon. So the remembrance, the devotion, the contemplation, the quiet, those spaces start to, when the pneuma starts being spiritually alchemized and it comes out of the lead, then there's a way in which the world becomes the walk of remembrance. And for some people, that's the eye of the camera capturing that, that special thing that makes something be more than just the literalness of whatever it is. There's a tree, fine, it's a tree. But when when you have a camera eye and you capture some moment, you're able to see the reflective light of spirit coming out from the deadness of the object. And this is what we all crave, and this lives in our homes. It lives in our families, where there is arguably no place in our lives more deadened with habit and more, just rank with the odor of familiarity. We're with each other, we know each other's smells, the repeated things that we say, the loops we get stuck in, the habits we have. The more familiar we are with each other, the more that Saturn will assert itself and become not only the status quo, but the kind of decrepit aging, the way that things start to fall apart and become, it's like the land of broken toys. You know what I mean? And if you ever saw the movie The Polar Express, by the way, the animated edition, which I watched with my kids, there's a train car at the end, and there's this kind of like a boy from the other side of the tracks, and he comes on the train, and they take him back into the place of forgotten toys, and he has to have this kind of spiritual encounter with that place. That's a Saturnine place. Before he can see the world shimmering with the aliveness of Christian spirit, Christian Christmas spirit, he has to go into that space, and he has to see all of the brokenness. There's this kind of journey that he goes on, and I might be messing up the storyline a little bit, but it is so part and parcel of the way in which, come to think of it, the sort of pagan Christian elements have been combined. But anyway. When he comes, before he can see the world shimmering with imagination and play and fantasy, which is so much of what Christmas is about for little children, is the way that life comes alive and the fantasy world is activated, like that. And it's such a celebration of it too. But that can't happen until there's this moving through the land of deadness and forgottenness and things like that. So there's this train car packed with the old toys. So when we live a life of remembrance, when it comes about, then it's as though the world starts to shimmer with this silver quality. Just like the moon, it goes from a dark rock to being lit up. But we also come to recognize, very important with the moon, is that the moon doesn't just make the world translucent with sort of, soft, nostalgic, mothering like bliss. It also, the moon sloughs off that light and becomes a dark, invisible rock again. And it does that every cycle. And this is the intimate, secret dance between Saturn and the moon, that the moon itself is Saturnine and Saturnine is lunar. These are two really important features of the relationship that they carry with one another. I'm giving a talk on this very topic this summer at the Great Lakes Astrology Conference, which is now online if you want to go check it out. Anyway, so the silvering of the moon eventually sloughs off, and then there's just a dead, invisible, dark rock. And our lives move in circles and cycles like that. The separation that we feel from others, or connection that we feel, if you've ever, sometimes it feels like that in the cycles and rhythms of your own body, or even if you're eating something, it's so good, and then about halfway through, you're like, it's not tasting so good anymore. They say like whatever the first 30 seconds or a couple of minutes that you eat, your taste buds exhaust the pleasure of what they're tasting, and then it becomes less and less characterizable on the palate. So similarly, there are natural interludes in life where things have to become really dead and kind of clunky, like the train car filled with the forgotten toys. So it has to become like that. And during that time, there's lamentation and there's remorse and there's feeling of abandonment, alienation, isolation, loneliness. It's the dark night of the soul. And in that place, if we're attentive to it, if we tend to it, that place doesn't last forever. It's a contractive place and it's a deadening place. And if we stay in it, then the light slowly starts to pour forth again. We have such little patience for that space. We're always trying to treat it, fix it, cure it, diagnose it, describe it until it's captured and we never ever have to deal with it again. All our lives built around convenience are in some ways built around the denial of Saturn, which is, inconvenience, negation, no's. So we deal with this in the world, we deal with it in ourselves. And silvering occurs when the dead material becomes a translucent medium, a reflective tool for insight and imagination. The world, in order for the world to be alive, we have to go through, we have to understand the aliveness of the world as a moving relationship between its aliveness and its hollowness. And that we participate in that as souls, that our lamentation is the rain that feeds our joy. And so seeing it like that is very important. And this is not the stuff you usually get with Cancer and Capricorn. You usually get stuff about family and, just kind of stereotypical stuff. But the opportunity for a solar eclipse in Cancer is to re-silver our world. Where something has been dead, we make it come to life again with the power of pneuma, the power of our imaginative, the fertile imaginative breath that we bring to things. So I want to read you a few last thoughts from James Hillman on this. Here's what he says, a few beautiful passages. The protection of lead and the release of silver from lead as a white dove indicates, and there's that Christian theme, kind of Christmas Christian. There's, of course, it's interesting, and not all Christians will appreciate this, but it's interesting that the two are so closely related, but very different as well. The alchemical, planetary, and to some extent pagan tradition of around this, as well as the Christian tradition, where the dove is always and only literally Jesus, which ironically ends up giving us a very dead Jesus. For example, why is it that we forget that the original Jesus was most likely dark-skinned or black? One of the reasons that we forget that image is because we try to literalize and concretize, who Jesus was rather than what kind of consciousness Jesus had. And ironically, when we try to concretize something in the image of light, we miss its real substance. And there's a play on that in the white skin Jesus versus the actual likely ethnicity of Jesus and what his skin color probably looked like. Anyway, that's just an aside, but it is to say that, anyway, I could go off on a long tangent on that. Sorry, I'll just get to the point. The protection of lead and the release of silver from lead as a white dove indicates the precious and noble nature attributed to silver. A whiteness with the wings of a dove can emerge from a leaden state that seems completely to enclose it. Think of enclosure, that's Saturn. The dull and heavy heart of lead conceals a dove of silver, sometimes magnesia. To extract it, we need dry heat and vinegar. Silver does not come forth easily, and a ton of smelted lead usually contains only a few ounces of silver. The release of the dove does not separate it from its weightiness, that gravitas of the spirit. It carries lead into its silver. Imagine the lead becoming winged, mobile, airborne, hovering over the operations with serious attentiveness, as a dove with outspread wings stays suspended over a scene in medieval icons. The spirit no longer caught in immanence only, immersed in laborious struggles with the dull and the dense. Lead, as the metal of Saturn, cold, heavy, dense, was not used widely before Roman times. Like silver, it was not technically as practical as were iron and copper, so that both lead and silver, like Saturn and the moon, were more otherworldly, more religious and mystical than the more worldly planets and metals of Mars, iron, Venus, copper, and Jupiter, tin. Typical of the Roman approach were the practical uses for lead and silver, plumbing and utensils for daily life. Silver decoration, for instance, was the boast of high society. So anyway, he goes on about that. So beautiful. Then he says this: depression is the price of silver. Melancholy has, ever since Aristotle's Problemata, been the disease of thinkers. The more white reflection, the more burdened lead. As we produce silver, we increase the lead. This is surely familiar. An insight may be shining in itself, but it makes no dent on the gray mood from which it came. We have the feeling of lead poisoning, a state of being swallowed by lead, lost in the lead mine. It's all so long and slow. What use, we feel, these silver mirrorings, this trickle of light, if the caughtness of depression does not lift? The truth, however, is that the depression is the mine. This is the lead necessary for the silver, even if the silver is neither useful nor functional in altering the lead. We mine silver from lead, but not to do away with the lead, for that would close down the mind. Here we must remember the curious metallurgic fact that silver corrupts in air. It tarnishes, it converts with the chlorides in rainwater so that it is naturally found mainly together in our gentiferous lead ores. Only very rarely can silver be found unalloyed under the earth in mountainous regions. Silver blackens in air and cannot always gleam as gold. Silver requires polishing, attention, a bit of rubbing and fussing. It calls for worry. Since exposure makes it lose its shine, it is best hidden, protected. It is covered with blackness by silence and dullness, and by hiding itself invisibly in lead. Perhaps this is why we cannot find much about it directly in alchemy. It is nearly always coupled with gold. What is occult in gold is manifest in silver, and what is manifest in gold is occult in silver. Manifest silver has brilliant and precious qualities of gold, and when we try to imagine the nature of silver using solar consciousness, silver becomes at once occulted, which then depresses silver into an amalgam with lead. That is exactly what I was talking about when I mentioned what happens when we try to make the alchemical lead into like a solar Christian redemptive thing rather than silvering it, which is why that slip of tongue that I had with the Christian and Christmas was so important. It's a catch of my own Christian background, So, but the silvering continues, and silvering, like the moon, is about remembrance. Silvering, like the moon, is about devotion, attention, care, worry. The mothering is not enough. The stereotype of mothering, it doesn't go far enough. But the concern, the worry, the attentiveness, the polishing, the sheltering, that's necessary in order to recover from the dullness of life, the precious emotional substance, can't even describe it. It flees. It doesn't like to be captured. So, but think about it this way: let's put a bow around it with the eclipses. It's an interesting symbol when the sun is in Cancer, and the sun is being eclipsed, and the sun in this new moon represents a new beginning, a new opportunity for the silvering, for remembrance, devotion, contemplation. That bringing of spirit through the cracks of the dullness of matter is upon us. On the Krishna Bhakti tradition, the examination of lead and moonlight is put in terms of the constant dance between Krishna and Radha, so that Krishna and Radha are lovers in a dance, and it's a depiction of divinity itself, God itself, and that they can never fully merge, and because there's always some room, some space for the other. And that space can feel like an eternal gap filled with sorrow and the heaviness of lead, separation, alienation, a departure from heaven. But it's that exact departure in Krishna Bhakti that we say allows for the personal, the intimate, and to reach out across the gap. So that separation is a necessary part of love, real chosen love between self and other. So Saturn and the moon, they're such a beautiful combination. And in our lives right now, again, you think of what's dull, what's dead, where there feels to be alienation, depression, heaviness. It's been exposed, it's been amplified with eclipses in Capricorn. And then on the other side, with the moon, is this invitation to start to bring that emotional, substantive, soulful connection back into the things that we're doing, to bring the world alive again. But it requires a subtlety, and it requires tending and care and devotion as a kind of constant practice. So wherever you're feeling the need to bring deeper emotional richness and to re-enliven things, to rebirth things, remember that Cancer was called the gateway of mankind and Capricorn the gateway of the gods. That the soul descends through Cancer into the body. The soul leaves the body in Capricorn. Saturn, moon, again, departure, arrival, back and forth, back and forth. When we think about birthing something new right now into our lives, we want to fill it with some kind of emotional substance. It's very important that for that substance to last and not quickly turn back into a literalism. And it turns into a literalism when we say, this is the new thing, this will be it, and I won't have need for anything else ever. That's it. Locked down, complete, enclosed, literalized. Eventually, what happens, the quicker we do that, the quicker we start to feel the melancholy, again, the sense of being apart from something. And so be careful of that. There's going to be the need to breathe new life into something, birth into something. But in order to maintain it, we have to learn how to stay close to the hollowness, the depressiveness, the emptiness, the pain, and long suffering that Saturn has exposed us to. Don't leave it behind in favor of something new. Bring it with. The silver is always close to the lead. And the best way to keep the newness around is to tend with all of the daily emotional nuances that we're experiencing, tend to the soul inside. That's not just don't, we can't, sometimes we all just tend to the thing that I set up, my job, my relationship, my home, my kids, and I'll tend to that stuff. And, there starts to be like a breakdown in the machine. It's because we've forgotten the spirit. Can't tend to the real spirit in everything if we're not tending to it in ourselves. If it's not alive in us, the medium through which it's experienced and connected to in others is not available. So every day, what does the moon tell us to do? It tells us, tend to your salvation in things by tending to it in yourself. Krishna in the Bhakti tradition is represented by the moon. The great prophet Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu from Bengal, the great an incarnation of Krishna that was came in the sort of Bengali, sort of started this big renaissance of Bhakti Yoga in India, born under a lunar eclipse, So, and that's definitely the song of my heart too. I was born the day before a lunar eclipse under the full moon in Capricorn with the sun in Cancer. So this is my jam, Anyway, I hope that this was helpful for you. I hope that you silver your life and that you tend to your soul with remembrance, devotion, care, attention, a little bit of worry and anxiety, and don't try to force the depressive leaden state out of it either, because we need that around. We need to keep that close with us. It's always the reminder from which we crave for that intimacy, in the same way that lovers' love for one another grows stronger in separation. So I hope you have a great solar eclipse. Leave me your stories. Tell me how you are experiencing these eclipses. I would love to hear from you, and we'll be back together again for a talk on the lunar eclipse in Capricorn. All right, take it easy, everyone. Bye.